May 1945, Camp Beale, California. Beneath a blazing sun that turned the parade ground into a shimmering mirage, Unteroffizier Klaus Hartmann stood with 300 other German prisoners, still wearing the torn remnants of Afrika Korps uniforms. They had been told to prepare for hard labor, the kind that broke men's spirits before it broke their bodies. After 2 years of North African campaigns, brutal combat in Tunisia, and the grinding defeat at Kasserine Pass, they thought they understood suffering. They had no idea how wrong they were about to be proven. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these battle-hardened soldiers were about to discover would shatter every assumption they held about their captors, about labor, and about the nature of the conflict that had consumed their youth. The hard labor they feared would become something they could barely recognize as work at all. Klaus had been captured near Tunis in May 1943, along with nearly 275,000 other German and Italian soldiers, when the North African campaign finally collapsed. The son of a Munich metalworker, he had joined up in 1939 at age 19, believing the promises of quick victory and continental supremacy. By 1943, covered in desert dust and half-starved, he had watched General von Arnim surrender what remained of Army Group Africa. The march into captivity had been a blur of exhaustion, shame, and uncertainty. Sergeant Werner Schulz stood beside Klaus, his weathered face betraying no emotion. At 32, Werner was one of the older prisoners, a veteran of campaigns in Poland and France before his transfer to North Africa. He had survived the siege of Tobruk, the grinding retreat across Libya, and the final desperate stand in Tunisia. Now he surveyed the American camp with the calculating eye of a man who had learned to read his circumstances quickly. The wooden barracks were clean, almost comfortable looking. The guards seemed relaxed, even casual. Something felt wrong, or rather, nothing felt as wrong as it should have. The camp commandant, Colonel Robert Harrison, a tall Texan with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen the trenches of the First World War, stood before them on a raised platform. An interpreter, a German-American sergeant named Friedrich Bauer, who had emigrated to Milwaukee in 1928, translated his words with precision. Colonel Harrison's voice carried across the assembled prisoners with an authority that required no shouting. "Your government told you many things about America," he began. "You were told we were weak, decadent, incapable of sacrifice or sustained effort. You were told our factories produced nothing of value, that our soldiers lacked discipline, that our nation would collapse at the first sign of real hardship." Klaus felt his jaw tighten. He had indeed been told these things, had believed them in the early days. The propaganda had painted Americans as soft capitalists who cared only for comfort and profit, who would flee at the first sign of genuine danger. Harrison continued, and Sergeant Bauer's translation flowed smoothly. "You are here because that information was incorrect. You are here because America produced more aircraft, more tanks, more ships, and more of everything needed to win this war than you were led to believe possible. But rather than explain this to you with words, we will show you with experience. You will work, you will labor, and then you will understand exactly how the industrial capacity of this nation operates." The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. Werner leaned slightly toward Klaus. "This sounds like the beginning of something brutal," he murmured. "I have heard stories about work camps," but Colonel Harrison's next words caught them completely off guard. "You will work 8 hours per day, 5 days per week. You will receive the same food rations as American soldiers. You will be paid 80 cents per day in canteen coupons for your labor. You will have access to medical care, recreational facilities, and educational programs. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention, which means with the same standards we would expect for our own prisoners in your custody." The silence that followed was profound. Klaus felt his mind struggling to process this information. 80 cents per day, the same food as American soldiers? His mind immediately went to comparisons with camps on the Eastern Front, where Soviet prisoners were worked to death on starvation rations, or the labor camps he had heard rumors about in Germany itself. The following morning, Klaus and Werner were assigned to an agricultural work detail at a farm 15 miles from Camp Beale. They rode in the back of a truck with 20 other prisoners, accompanied by only 2 guards who seemed more interested in chatting with each other than in brandishing their weapons. The California landscape rolled past, impossibly green for men accustomed to desert sand and North African scrubland. The farm belonged to a man named Thomas Richardson, a 56-year-old veteran who had himself served in France during the previous war. He stood waiting for them, a short, stocky man with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of decades of agricultural labor. His farm produced tomatoes, lettuce, and almonds for California's booming wartime agricultural industry. Richardson addressed them through the interpreter, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I need help with the harvest. The work is straightforward. We pick tomatoes, load them into crates, transport them to the packing shed. You work from 7 in the morning until noon, take an hour lunch, then work until 4 in the afternoon. Anyone who tries to escape will be shot, but honestly, you would have to be stupid to try. Where would you go?" Klaus had expected to be driven to exhaustion, to be given impossible quotas, to face punishment for any shortfall in productivity. Instead, Richardson demonstrated the work himself, showing them how to select ripe tomatoes, how to place them gently in the crates to avoid bruising, how to stack the full crates for transport. He worked alongside them for the first hour, his movements efficient and practiced, setting a pace that was steady but not brutal. By mid-morning, Klaus found himself settling into a rhythm. The California sun was hot, but nothing compared to the killing heat of the Sahara. The work was repetitive but not complex. Around him, other prisoners were coming to similar realizations. They exchanged quiet comments, careful to avoid drawing attention from the guards. "This is not hard labor," Werner muttered, as they loaded crates onto a flatbed truck. "This is just farm work, regular farm work. I did harder work than this as a boy in Bavaria." Klaus nodded, unable to articulate the strange mixture of relief and confusion he felt. Everything he had been conditioned to expect about American cruelty and exploitation was proving false. It was disorienting in a way that combat had never been. In combat, you knew your enemy. Here, the enemy was feeding you, paying you, and treating you with a basic human decency that contradicted years of indoctrination. The lunch that day was another revelation. Richardson's wife, Mary, a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and flour on her apron, had prepared sandwiches for the work crew. Each prisoner received 2 thick sandwiches made with fresh bread, roast beef, cheese, lettuce, and tomato, along with an apple and a canteen of cold lemonade. Klaus stared at his plate in disbelief. This was more and better food than he had seen in a single meal since before his deployment to North Africa. Werner bit into his sandwich and actually closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the taste. He opened them and looked at Klaus with an expression that mixed wonder with something like shame. "We told ourselves they were the barbarians," he said quietly. "We told ourselves we were bringing civilization and order to an inferior people. Klaus, I have eaten better today as a prisoner on an American farm than I ate as a soldier fighting for Germany." That evening, back at Camp Beale, the prisoners gathered in small groups to process their experiences. Klaus sat with Werner and 3 others in their barracks, a clean wooden structure with proper beds, mattresses and blankets. Outside they could hear American soldiers playing baseball, their shouts and laughter carrying across the compound. Corporal Hans Fischer, a 23-year-old from Hamburg who had been a merchant before the conflict, spoke with careful precision. "I worked today in a warehouse sorting supplies for shipment to the Pacific Theater. The warehouse was the size of 3 football fields. I counted more crates of food in one section than I saw in an entire month at our supply depot in Tunisia. The guard told me this was just one of 47 such warehouses in California alone." Private Otto Zimmermann, barely 20 years old, had been assigned to a construction crew repairing roads. "They gave us new work gloves," he said, holding up his hands as if the gloves were artifacts from an alien civilization. "American prisoners in Germany do not receive new work gloves. They do not receive new anything. And the tools, all of them new or well-maintained." The American sergeant in charge apologized because one of the shovels had a slightly bent handle. Klaus listened to these accounts and felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of the world. Over the following weeks and months, This shift would only deepen. By June, Klaus had been assigned to a different work detail, this time at a lumber mill in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The mill processed timber for construction of military barracks and cargo ship components. The mill owner, a man named George Patterson, ran his operation with the efficiency of someone who understood that time was money and that wasting resources was foolish, regardless of who was doing the work. On Klaus's first day, Patterson gathered the prisoner work crew and explained the operation with straightforward practicality. This mill processes approximately 15,000 board feet of lumber per day. Your job is to help move lumber from the saws to the sorting area, stack it properly for drying, and load finished lumber onto trucks. The work requires attention to detail and consistent effort. If you work well, you will be assigned here permanently. If you create problems, you will be sent back to the camp and given different work assignments. What struck Klaus was not the work itself, which was physically demanding, but well within the capabilities of men who had marched across North Africa, but the casual assumption of competence. Patterson did not treat them as defeated enemies to be punished or humiliated. He treated them as workers whose labor had value and who were expected to perform their tasks with professional skill. The revelation came during a lunch break 3 weeks into Klaus's assignment at the mill. Patterson had joined the work crew to discuss production quotas, and the conversation had drifted to broader topics. Klaus, emboldened by weeks of fair treatment, asked a question that had been burning in his mind. Through the interpreter, he asked, "Why do you treat us this way? We are your enemies. We fought against you. Why feed us well, pay us, treat us with respect?" Patterson considered the question for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. He was a man who chose his words carefully. "Son," he finally said, "America is not fighting this war because we hate Germans. We are fighting because your government started a conflict that threatened the entire world order. But you, personally, you are just a young man who got caught up in something bigger than yourself. Treating you with cruelty would not make America stronger or better. It would just make us cruel." He paused, then continued. "Besides, practical considerations matter. You work better when you are fed properly and treated fairly. You cause fewer problems when you are not desperate or resentful. And when this war ends, and it will end with Germany's complete defeat, we will need Germans who understand that Americans are not monsters. We will need Germans who can tell others what they experienced here." Klaus felt something crack inside him, a wall of belief and indoctrination that he had not even fully recognized was there. He had been told that Americans were motivated only by greed, that they lacked any sense of honor or higher purpose, that they would exploit defeated enemies without mercy. Every single day of his captivity was disproving these claims in ways that mere propaganda could never counter. By September 1945, after the war in Europe had ended and the conflict with Japan was concluding, Klaus had been at Camp Beale for over 2 years. In that time he had worked on farms, in lumber mills, in canneries, and in road construction crews. He had been paid for his labor, fed better than he had been fed as a soldier, and treated with a basic human dignity that contradicted everything he had been taught to expect. One evening in mid-September, Colonel Harrison called an assembly of all prisoners in the camp. "The war is over," he announced. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. Japan has also surrendered. The conflict that brought you here has ended. You will remain in American custody for some time longer, while repatriation arrangements are made, but your status has changed. You are no longer prisoners of an ongoing war. You are men waiting to return home." Klaus stood in the assembly and felt the weight of those words. Home. What did that even mean now? Germany lay in ruins. Its cities destroyed by years of aerial bombardment, its economy collapsed, its government dissolved. The ideology that had sent him to war had been thoroughly and completely defeated. And he, Klaus Hartmann, former Unteroffizier in the Afrika Korps, had spent the last years of the conflict picking tomatoes in California and cutting lumber in the Sierra Nevada. Werner, standing beside him as always, spoke quietly. "I have written to my sister in Bremen. She says the city is rubble. No food, no fuel, no electricity. People are starving. She asked if I could send food parcels from America." Klaus nodded slowly. The irony was almost overwhelming. German prisoners in America had access to more food, better living conditions, and greater security than German civilians in Germany. The reversal was so complete, so total, that it bordered on the absurd. In the months that followed, before his eventual repatriation in mid-1946, Klaus participated in a documentary film project initiated by the American military government. The project aimed to create a record of the POW experience, both for historical purposes and as a tool for re-education efforts in occupied Germany. Klaus was interviewed extensively about his experiences. The interviewer, a Captain James Morrison from the Army's Historical Division, asked him direct questions about his perceptions and experiences. "What surprised you most about your time in American captivity?" Klaus considered the question carefully. "Everything," he said finally. "We were told that Americans were weak, that they could not organize effective production or maintain discipline. We were told they would treat prisoners with cruelty and exploitation. Instead, we found a nation with industrial capacity, beyond anything we had imagined, and treatment that exceeded the standards of the Geneva Convention. The gap between what we were told and what we experienced was total." Captain Morrison pressed further. "Do you believe this treatment was unique to you or representative of broader American approaches?" Klaus thought about the hundreds of camps across America, the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who had similar experiences. "I believe it was systematic," he said. "Not because Americans are inherently good people, though many are, but because America structured its prisoner system to be efficient and productive. They understood that well-treated prisoners work better, cause fewer problems, and cost less to manage. It was practical, not sentimental, but the result was the same: treatment that contradicted everything we had been told to expect." The documentary project revealed patterns across thousands of prisoner experiences. Gefreiter Paul Richter, from Leipzig, spoke about working in a canning factory in Oregon, where the production lines processed vegetables and fruits with mechanical efficiency that seemed almost magical to someone from a nation where industrial capacity had been stretched beyond breaking. "The factory processed 20,000 cans per hour," he reported. 20,000. In 1 hour. And this was just one factory among hundreds. How did we ever think we could win against this level of production? Unteroffizier Martin Keller from Berlin described his assignment to a logging operation in Washington state, where he operated machinery that would have been considered advanced equipment in any German industrial operation. "The Americans gave us training on the equipment," he said. "Real training, not just a quick demonstration. They wanted us to work safely and efficiently because accidents would slow production. They treated their tools and machinery with care because they understood that maintaining equipment was more cost-effective than replacing it. Everything was calculated. Everything was systematic. It was almost frightening in its efficiency." Obergefreiter Erich Schneider from Hamburg worked at a military supply depot in Texas, where he helped organize and ship materials destined for the Pacific Theater. "The scale was incomprehensible," he stated in his interview. "We moved more supplies in 1 day than I saw our entire division receive in a month in North Africa. And the waste, which was not really waste but abundance. If a crate was damaged, they did not try to salvage every item. They simply marked it for secondary distribution and brought in a new crate. They had so much that perfect efficiency was less important than speed." Werner Schulz, in his own interview, was more blunt. "I fought for Germany for 6 years," he said. "I believed we were the superior civilization, that we represented order and discipline against chaos and degeneracy. Then I spent 2 years as a prisoner in California, picking fruit and cutting wood, eating better food than I had ever eaten as a soldier, working shorter hours with better conditions than I had known in my entire adult life. If this is what American weakness looks like, then we fundamentally misunderstood the nature of strength." The recreational facilities at Camp Beale provided another layer of contradiction to everything the prisoners had expected. The camp library held over 3,000 books in German, ranging from technical manuals to classical literature. Educational programs offered courses in English, mathematics, and various trades. Prisoners could form sports teams, organize theatrical performances, and even publish a camp newspaper. Klaus found himself attending English classes twice a week, taught by a German-American volunteer from Sacramento who believed that language skills would help prisoners rebuild their lives after repatriation. Private Johann Meyer, a 21-year-old from Stuttgart who had been assigned to the same agricultural work detail as Klaus, spoke about his experience with genuine bewilderment one evening in the camp recreation hall. "Before I was captured," he said, "our officers told us that American prisoners in Germany received adequate care. But my brother wrote me from the Eastern Front before I was captured. He described Soviet prisoner conditions, the starvation, the death rates. Now I learn that American prisoners in Germany face similar deprivation, while we sit here with full meals, medical care, and English classes. The hypocrisy is stunning." Corporal Friedrich Braun, at 28, a veteran of the French campaign in North Africa, added his perspective. "I work today at a dairy farm owned by a family named Peterson. The farmer's son is serving in the army somewhere in the Pacific. Mrs. Peterson brought us cold milk during our break and asked, through the interpreter, if we received letters from our families. She said she worried about all the mothers who did not know if their sons were alive or dead. This woman, whose son is fighting against our country, showed more concern for our welfare than I saw from our own officers in the final months in Tunisia. The contrast extended to medical care. Camp Biel had a fully equipped hospital staffed by American military doctors and medics, supplemented by German medical officers who had been among the prisoners. Klaus witnessed this firsthand when he developed a severe respiratory infection in August 1945. He was admitted to the camp hospital, given a private bed with clean sheets, and treated with penicillin, the antibiotic that American pharmaceutical companies had scaled up to mass production during the war. Within 5 days, his infection had cleared, and he returned to work detail. The German doctor who treated him, Oberstabsarzt Heinrich Vogel, a military physician who had been captured along with Klaus in Tunisia, spoke candidly about what he had observed. "I have access to medical supplies and equipment here that exceeded what I had available at our field hospital in North Africa," he said. "The Americans have industrialized medicine the same way they have industrialized everything else. Penicillin alone has probably saved more lives in this war than any other single innovation, and they produce it in quantities that would have seemed impossible just 5 years ago." The truth that Klaus and Werner and thousands of others discovered was stark and undeniable. American hard labor was not hard by the standards they had known. 8-hour days with weekends off was not exhausting by the measure of soldiers who had marched across deserts. Payment for work was not exploitation by the standard of men who had served without meaningful compensation. And treatment according to international law was not cruelty by any measure at all. The psychological impact was profound. Klaus returned to Germany in June 1946, repatriated through a processing center in Bremen, and eventually making his way back to Munich. The city he remembered was gone, replaced by rubble and desperate survival. Food was scarce, housing was inadequate, and the economic system had collapsed into barter and black market trading. His first meal back in Germany, a thin soup made from potato peels and minimal vegetables, was worse than anything he had eaten in 2 years of American captivity. His father, surviving but gaunt, listened to Klaus's stories about California with an expression that mixed disbelief with bitter recognition. "They defeated us so thoroughly that even their prisoners lived better than we did," he said quietly. "How do you fight an enemy like that? How do you sustain belief in your own superiority when the evidence is so completely contrary?" Klaus had no answer. The question itself revealed the depth of the defeat that Germany had experienced, a defeat not just of military forces but of ideology and worldview. Over the years that followed, Klaus became part of a generation of Germans who had to reconcile the myths they had been taught with the reality they had experienced. He spoke at local meetings about his time in America, describing the camps, the work, the treatment he had received. Some listeners accused him of exaggeration or of being corrupted by enemy propaganda. But others, particularly those who had also been prisoners in American camps, nodded in recognition. They had all experienced the same profound disconnect between expectation and reality. By the early 1950s, as Germany began its reconstruction under the Marshall Plan, Klaus had found work as a supervisor at a manufacturing facility in Munich, part of the economic miracle that transformed West Germany from ruins to prosperity. He married, started a family, built a comfortable middle-class life in the new democratic Germany. But he never forgot those months in California, picking tomatoes under a blazing sun and marveling at the basic decency of his captors. Werner Schultz settled in Bremen, working in the rebuilt port facilities and eventually becoming a minor union official. He maintained correspondence with Klaus over the decades, and their letters often returned to those strange months in 1945 when their understanding of the world had been turned upside down. In one letter from 1957, Werner wrote, "I think often about Farmer Richardson and his wife who made us those sandwiches. I wonder if they understood what they were doing, how their simple acts of decent treatment were undermining everything we had been told to believe. Probably not. They were just being themselves, treating us as they would want to be treated. And that, in its way, was the most devastating argument against everything we had fought for." Klaus kept that letter, along with others, in a box in his study. Sometimes, when historical documentaries about the war appeared on television, showing combat footage and strategic analyses, he would think about the untold story of psychological warfare, conducted not through propaganda, but through simple, decent treatment. Germany had tried to win through brutality and terror. America had defeated that approach, not just with superior force, but with a systematic demonstration that their system, their values, and their capacity for organization exceeded anything Germany could match. The full scope of America's prisoner program was staggering when viewed in statistical terms. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States held approximately 425,000 German and Italian prisoners in more than 500 camps across 46 states. These prisoners contributed approximately $155 million worth of labor to the American war effort and economy, working in agriculture, logging, manufacturing, and construction. The program was designed from its inception to be self-sustaining, with prisoner labor offsetting the costs of maintaining the camps. But beyond the statistics lay the human impact that Klaus and Werner represented. Thousands of German soldiers returned home with first-hand experience of American productivity, organization, and basic decency. They became living contradictions to the propaganda they had been fed, witnesses to a reality that undermined the ideological foundations of the regime they had served. In the post-war years, as Germany struggled to understand how it had been so thoroughly defeated, these former prisoners provided an answer that was more devastating than any military analysis. They had not just been outfought. They had been outproduced, outorganized, and fundamentally misled about the nature of their enemy. Klaus Hartmann lived until 1998, dying at age 78 in a comfortable apartment in Munich, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up in a peaceful, prosperous Germany that bore no resemblance to the nation he had served as a young soldier. In his final years, he occasionally spoke to history students about his experiences, trying to explain what it had been like to have every assumption about the world proven wrong through the simple act of decent treatment. The hard labor he had feared in that California camp in May 1945 had turned out to be regular farm work, 8-hour days, proper food, and basic human dignity. The revelation had not come through dramatic moments or philosophical arguments, but through the accumulated weight of daily experience, the undeniable reality of being treated better as a prisoner than he had been treated as a soldier, of working in conditions that exceeded anything he had known in his own country. That was the hard labor that broke not bodies, but beliefs. The systematic demonstration that everything he had been told was wrong, that the enemy he had fought was not weak or cruel or incapable, but rather organized, productive, and secure enough in their own strength to treat defeated enemies with basic humanity. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.